2 years after my wife passed away, I finally called an electrician to rewire her workshop. When he called me at 10 in the morning, his voice was shaking. He said, "Richard, come home right now. I found something hidden in the wall, but do not bring anyone with you." When I got there, I froze in shock at what I saw. If you are watching this, take a deep breath, because what I am about to tell you is something I never imagined would happen in my own family under my own roof. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you are watching from today. It helps me know I am not alone in this dark journey. My name is Richard. I am 77 years old, and I spent 40 years of my life building a commercial construction company from the dirt, up right here in Denver, Colorado. My hands are scarred, calloused, and tired. That Tuesday morning, I was standing in the middle of a local hardware store, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of cut pine and machine oil. I was holding a heavy spool of copper wire, running my thumb over the thick insulation. I was finally getting around to remodeling Evelyn's old jewelry workshop in our backyard. Evelyn was my wife. She passed away 2 years ago from what the doctors called a sudden heart attack. That workshop was her ultimate sanctuary. For 24 long months, I could not even bring myself to turn the doorknob. The grief was simply too heavy. But that morning, I decided it was time to let go. I hired Mike, an old-school electrician I had worked alongside for 3 decades, to upgrade the electrical panels. I wanted to turn the space into a quiet study. I wanted to move on with the time I had left. Then my cell phone vibrated heavily in my chest pocket. I pulled it out and saw Mike's name flashing on the screen. I smiled to myself, assuming he was going to complain about the outdated breaker box or ask me where I kept the spare fuses. I answered the call fully prepared to make a joke about his bad knees. But there was no laughter on the other end of the line. There was only heavy, ragged breathing. "Mike," I said, leaning against a display of power tools. "Is everything all right?" "Richard." His voice cracked. It sounded thin, stripped of all its usual gruffness. "Richard, you need to come home right now." I stood up straight, my muscles suddenly tense. The casual ease of the morning evaporated in a split second. "What happened? Did you cut a live wire? Are you hurt?" "No, I am not hurt." Mike's voice dropped to a frantic, urgent whisper, almost as if he was afraid the walls around him were listening. I was tearing down the drywall behind Evelyn's main workbench so I could run the new electrical conduit. I hit something hard. Richard found something hidden inside the wall. A sharp chill ran down my spine, settling deeply at the base of my neck. "What do you mean you found something hidden? Just get over here." And Richard listened to me very carefully. "Do not tell your son about this. Do not tell your daughter-in-law. Do not bring anyone with you. Come alone." Before I could ask another question, the line went dead. I stood there in the bright aisles of the hardware store, the dial tone buzzing against my ear like a trapped hornet. My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs. Mike was a man who had seen absolutely everything. Over the years, we had worked on demolition sites where we uncovered everything from dangerous chemicals to bags of stolen kafsesh, and the man had never so much as blinked. But today, right now, he sounded genuinely terrified. I dropped the spool of copper wire onto the nearest shelf and walked straight out of the store. I climbed into my old Ford truck. The engine roared to life, and I pulled out onto the main road, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. The drive from the hardware store to my house usually took about 20 minutes. I made it in 12. My mind raced through 1,000 different terrifying scenarios as the Denver suburbs blurred past my windows. Evelyn had been a gentle, loving soul. She spent her days shaping silver polishing stones and tending to her rose garden. What could she possibly have hidden inside a wall? And why would it make a seasoned contractor sound like a frightened child? Mike had specifically told me not to tell Jason. That was the part that chilled me the absolute most. Jason was my only son, my own flesh and blood. After Evelyn died, I stepped back and handed over the daily operations of my construction empire to him. I trusted him with my legacy, my finances, my entire life. And his wife Monica was always hovering around, constantly asking questions about estate planning and property values. Why would Mike mention them? I turned onto my street, the tires of my truck squealing slightly as I pulled into the long driveway of the home I had built with my own two hands. The house sat far back from the road, surrounded by tall oak trees that Evelyn had planted when Jason was just a toddler. I threw the truck into park and left the keys dangling in the ignition. The morning air was sharp and cold. The property was dead silent. I walked around the side of the garage, my heavy boots crunching against the gravel path that led to the backyard. The door to the workshop was wide open. A thick cloud of white drywall dust hung heavily in the air, catching the morning sunlight in a hazy, suffocating glow. I stepped inside the room, coughing slightly as the chalky powder coated the back of my throat. "Mike," I called out. My voice sounded hollow in the empty space. Mike was standing in the far corner right near the window where Evelyn used to sit and solder her rings. He was gripping his steel crowbar, his face pale, staring blankly at the wall. He did not even turn to look at me when I walked in. He just raised a trembling finger and pointed. I followed his gaze. The drywall directly behind the heavy wooden workbench had been completely smashed open. Jagged pieces of plaster and insulation littered the hardwood floor. And there, nestled deep between two thick structural wooden studs, was a heavy metallic fireproof lockbox. It was not just sitting there casually. It had been intentionally and permanently secured. 4 heavy-duty industrial screws anchored the heavy metal box directly into the foundational beams of the house. Someone had gone to great exhausting lengths to ensure this box could never be moved, never be accidentally discovered, and never be opened without a serious fight. My breath caught in my throat. I walked slowly toward the damaged wall, my boots grinding the broken drywall into a fine white powder. I reached out, tracing the cold gray steel of the box with my fingertips. The metal was covered in a thick layer of dust, indicating it had been sealed inside this dark tomb for a very long time, probably right before Evelyn passed away. I stared at the heavy padlock securing the latch. My mind screamed at me to walk away, to leave the secrets of the dead buried where they belonged. But the silence in the room was deafening, pressing down on my shoulders like a physical weight. My wife had deliberately hidden this from me. She had torn open the wall of her own sanctuary, drilled this safe into the very bones of our house, and plastered over it all without breathing a single word to the man she had slept next to for 45 years. Why? What was so incredibly dangerous that it had to be buried in the dark? I reached into my tool belt and pulled out my heavy flathead screwdriver. I wedged it firmly under the latch of the lockbox, my muscles tensing, as I prepared to force the metal open and uncover the truth. But before I could apply the pressure, the sharp, violent screech of tires tearing into my driveway shattered the silence. Car doors slammed shut outside. Footsteps crunched rapidly against the gravel path, moving with desperate energy. I pulled my screwdriver away from the metal latch and turned toward the open doorway, just as 2 figures burst into the dusty workshop. It was Jason and Monica. They were both breathing heavily, their chests heaving, as if they had just sprinted for a mile. Jason wore a tailored navy suit, the kind he reserved for closing deals at the corporate office I had handed over to him. Monica was in a sleek designer dress, her pristine heels sinking slightly into the white plaster dust covering the floorboards. It was 10:30 on a Tuesday morning. They were supposed to be in a board meeting downtown nearly 40 minutes away. Instead, they were standing in my backyard staring at the shattered drywall with a level of intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Dad," Jason gasped, taking a quick step forward. "What on earth are you doing out here?" He did not look at me when he asked the question. His eyes were locked onto the metal lockbox sitting in the exposed wall cavity. I saw his throat swallow hard. Beside him, Monica looked completely paralyzed. Her face was drained of all color. Her eyes darted wildly from the lockbox to Mike, and then finally to me. It was not just surprise I saw in her expression. It was pure, unadulterated panic. The panic of a trapped animal. "I am doing exactly what I told you I was going to do last week," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and calm. "I hired Mike to rewire the old workshop. We found something in the wall." Jason aggressively pushed past me, kicking a piece of broken drywall out of his way. He turned to Mike, his face flushed with sudden anger. "Hey, you need to pack up your tools and get off this property right now. The job is canceled." Mike looked at me uncertain, gripping his crowbar tightly. I raised a single hand, signaling for the old electrician to stay exactly where he was. Jason spun back around to face me, attempting to compose himself. He plastered on a tight, artificial smile that did not reach his eyes. "Look, Dad. I am sorry for yelling," Jason said, his voice dropping into a smooth, practiced tone. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "But you cannot be tearing down these walls today. Monica and I have been working on a massive expansion for the company. We are trying to secure a new commercial line of credit, and the bank is sending an appraiser over to evaluate this entire estate for collateral. Any unpermitted demolition work is going to instantly tank the property value. You have to stop right now." I stood there in silence, letting his words hang in the dusty air. I looked down at his soft, manicured hands. Sunlight caught his $15,000 Rolex, a watch he bought with the profits of the company I had built with 40 years of sweat-broken nails and aching joints. When Jason was a boy, I worked 16-hour shifts pouring concrete in the freezing Denver winters just to ensure he could attend private school. I wanted him to have the soft life I never had. But looking at him now, I realized that softness bred a terrifying sense of entitlement. His story made no logical sense. Even if a bank appraiser was coming, they would only care about the square footage and the structural integrity of the main house. They would not care about an old jewelry workshop in the backyard. And more importantly, a bank appraisal had absolutely nothing to do with a hidden lockbox bolted to the internal framing. "Is that so?" I replied, staring directly into his eyes. "Well, the appraiser can evaluate the property just fine. But this box belonged to your mother. It is coming inside with me." I reached into the wall and firmly gripped the heavy steel handle of the lockbox. As I pulled it free from the loosened drywall, Jason lunged forward, his hands grasping at the metal. "Dad, stop!" Jason insisted, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to pry it from my grip. "Give it to me. It is probably just a bunch of rusted junk or old receipts she forgot to throw away. Let me throw it in the dumpster for you. You do not need to be digging through trash today." His grip was strong, but he had spent his life behind a desk. I had spent mine lifting steel beams. I planted my boots firmly on the floorboards, squared my shoulders, and pulled the box away from him with a sharp yank. He stumbled forward, catching his balance just before hitting the workbench. "Jason," I said. My voice was no longer calm. It was the deep, unwavering tone I used when he was a teenager, lying his way out of a suspension. The voice of a father who will not be challenged in his own home. "Take a step back. Right now." He froze. The authoritative tone hit him like a physical blow, stripping his corporate bravado. He took a slow step backward, his hands falling to his sides. I turned to Monica. She retreated toward the doorway, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She pulled her phone from her purse and began typing frantically, her thumbs flying across the screen. I did not know who she was messaging, but she looked as though her life depended on it. I tucked the dirt-covered box under my arm. The metal felt cold against me. I looked at Jason, taking in the fear radiating from his posture. I nodded to Mike, thanking him silently, and then I walked out of the dusty workshop. I left my son and his wife standing in the debris as I carried the final secret of my late wife into the house. I walked through the back door and stepped into the quiet kitchen, the heavy steel lockbox pressed firmly against my ribs. The familiar hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house, a sharp contrast to the chaotic tension I had just left behind in the dusty workshop. My boots left faint, powdery white footprints on the dark hardwood floor, marking my path down the long hallway. I reached the master bedroom at the far end of the house, stepped inside, and pushed the heavy oak door shut. I reached out and turned the brass thumb turn, engaging the deadbolt with a solid, reassuring click. I was locked in. I walked slowly over to the edge of the large mattress and sat down. The springs groaned softly beneath my weight. I placed the metal box carefully on my lap, resting my calloused hands on its cold, unforgiving surface. It was heavy, much heavier than an empty steel casing should be. A thick layer of plaster dust coated the lid, settling into the crevices of the heavy-duty padlock that secured the front latch. I sat there, in the absolute stillness of my bedroom, staring down at the dirty metal, feeling a deep physical knot tightening in the center of my stomach. My intuition, sharpened by decades of navigating the ruthless world of commercial construction, was screaming at me. Evelyn had been a woman of incredible transparency. In 45 years of marriage, we had shared everything. We shared our bank accounts, our fears, and our dreams. She was the kind of woman who would leave notes on the kitchen counter if she went to the grocery store for 10 minutes. She did not keep secrets. She certainly did not tear open the structural walls of her own creative sanctuary to bury a locked safe in the dark. Unless she was terrified. That thought hit me with the force of a swinging hammer. Evelyn had not hidden this box to conceal her own sins. She had hidden it to protect something, or to protect someone. And based on the sheer, unadulterated terror I had just witnessed on my daughter-in-law's face, I knew exactly who Evelyn was trying to protect me from. Monica had looked like a ghost standing in that workshop. She had looked like a criminal caught standing over a body. And my son, my own flesh and blood, had immediately lied straight to my face about a bank appraisal that made absolutely no logical sense. I took a slow, deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. I set the heavy lockbox down on the quilt beside me and stood up. I walked over to the large bay window that overlooked the front driveway. I reached out and gently parted the heavy fabric of the curtains, standing back in the shadows so I could not be seen from below. Down in the driveway, Jason and Monica were standing beside their luxury sedan. They were not leaving. They were fighting. Even through the thick, double-paned glass of my bedroom window, I could see the vicious intensity of their argument. Monica was pacing back and forth across the asphalt, her arms flailing wildly in the air. She was pointing an accusatory finger directly at Jason's chest, her face twisted in an ugly mask of rage and desperation. Jason was shaking his head rapidly, rubbing his temples, looking around frantically, as if he expected the police to suddenly pull up to the curb. He grabbed Monica by the elbow, trying to pull her toward the passenger door, but she violently yanked her arm away from his grasp. I watched them with a cold, sinking feeling in my chest. This was not a normal marital dispute over a misunderstanding. This was the frantic, terrifying behavior of two people whose entire world was on the verge of collapsing. They were standing in my driveway, arguing over a box they claimed was filled with meaningless junk. As I watched Jason desperately trying to calm his wife down, my mind drifted back through the years. I remembered the bitter, freezing winters in Denver when he was just a little boy. I remembered waking up at 4 a.m, putting on 3 layers of thermal clothing, and driving an unheated truck to job sites covered in thick sheets of ice. I spent my youth hauling steel beams, pouring concrete, and breathing in toxic dust just to keep our heads above water. I ruined my knees and destroyed my lower back so that Jason would never have to know what true physical exhaustion felt like. When he turned 16, I worked 80-hour weeks for 6 straight months to buy him his first car, a safe, reliable sedan, so he would not have to take the public bus in the snow. I remembered handing him those keys. I remembered the pride swelling in my chest, believing I was giving him the foundation for a wonderful, honest life. Now, looking down through the window, I watched the morning sunlight catch the rim of the expensive watch wrapped around Jason's wrist. It was a $15,000 timepiece, a watch he wore on hands that had never swung a hammer, never dug a trench, and never built a single honest thing from the ground up. I had handed him the keys to my entire construction empire, a multi-million-dollar company I built from nothing, simply because I loved him. I had given him everything, and in return, he was standing in my driveway, terrified of a rusted metal box his dead mother had hidden in a wall. The argument below abruptly ended. Monica shoved Jason hard in the chest, turned around, and marched toward the street, dialing her cell phone with frantic urgency. Jason let out a visible scream of frustration, kicking the front tire of his expensive car before climbing into the driver's seat and slamming the door shut. The engine roared. The rest of the day passed in a suffocating blur. I did not leave the house. I did not answer the phone when it rang 3 separate times, each caller ID displaying Jason's office number. I simply sat in the armchair in the corner of my bedroom, staring at the metal lockbox resting on the carpet at my feet. The sun slowly dipped below the horizon, casting long, twisted shadows across the hardwood floor. I had decided not to force the padlock open just yet. I needed the absolute stillness of the night to process everything that had happened. I needed to gather my strength. I made a simple dinner that I could barely eat, turned off all the lights on the ground floor, and retreated back to my bedroom. I pushed the lockbox deep under the heavy oak frame of my bed, completely out of sight. By midnight, the house was completely silent. I lay on my back, staring up at the ceiling fan, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Sleep was entirely impossible. My mind was a relentless storm of questions and betrayals. I kept seeing the absolute terror in Monica's eyes and the aggressive desperation in my son's posture. They were hiding something massive, something that terrified them enough to rush over in the middle of a workday to stop an electrician from doing his job. The digital clock on my nightstand slowly flipped to 2 in the morning. The glowing red numbers cast a faint light across the room. Then I heard it. It was a sound so faint I almost convinced myself it was just the house settling in the cold night air. But decades of working on construction sites had trained my ears to pick up every subtle anomaly. It was the distinct squeak of the 3rd stair on the main staircase. Someone was inside my house. Someone was creeping up to the 2nd floor. My blood ran completely cold. I lay perfectly still, forcing my muscles to relax, regulating my breathing into the deep, slow rhythm of a sleeping old man. I even let out a soft, consistent snore. I kept my eyes closed just enough to protect my vision from any sudden light, but open just a fraction of an inch so I could see the bottom of my bedroom door. A moment later, a dark shadow blocked the faint ambient light coming from the hallway window. The shadow crept slowly under the gap of my door, hovering right outside my room. Whoever was out there was standing perfectly still, listening. I continued my rhythmic, heavy breathing, my heart hammering against my ribs with a violent force. I prayed they could not hear the frantic pounding in my chest. Then the brass doorknob slowly began to turn. It rotated silently until it hit the internal mechanism of the locked deadbolt. A long, agonizing pause followed. They knew the door was locked. A soft metallic scratching noise broke the silence. A key. They had a spare key to my private bedroom. The deadbolt clicked open with a sharp snap that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. The door slowly creaked open just wide enough for a figure to slip inside. A narrow, blinding beam of white light swept across the floorboards. It was the flashlight from a cell phone. The intruder moved with frantic, desperate energy, sweeping the light around the perimeter of the room. As the beam bounced off the mirror on my dresser, the ambient reflection illuminated the intruder's face. It was Monica. She was wearing dark clothes, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail. She looked absolutely unhinged. Her eyes were wide, darting into every corner, scanning every flat surface. She was hunting for the lockbox. She took a silent step toward my closet, sliding the mirrored door open with agonizing care. I watched her through my eyelashes, maintaining my steady snoring. She dropped to her knees, frantically tossing my winter boots aside, sweeping her hands over the top shelf, patting down the pockets of my heavy winter coats. She was tearing through my personal belongings like a starving animal looking for scraps. The audacity of it made my stomach churn. This was my daughter-in-law, a woman who sat at my Thanksgiving table smiling and pouring wine, now creeping through my bedroom in the dead of night to steal a box left by my dead wife. She closed the closet door and moved toward my armchair. She ran her hands under the seat cushion, feeling around the base. Nothing. She stood up, her chest heaving with silent, frustrated breaths. The beam of her phone flashlight suddenly swept toward the bed. It traveled up the heavy quilt, stopping right on my face. I did not flinch. I kept my facial muscles entirely slack, my breathing deep and uninterrupted. For 10 agonizing seconds, she kept the light focused directly on my closed eyelids. If I twitched, if my breathing hitched for even a fraction of a second, she would know I was awake. I felt entirely exposed, vulnerable in my own bed, while a woman who clearly wished me harm stood over me. Finally, the light shifted away. She let out a faint, trembling sigh of defeat. She turned around, crept back toward the door, and slipped out into the dark hallway. The door clicked shut behind her. A moment later, I heard the metallic snap of the deadbolt locking from the outside. She had locked me back in. I waited 5 full minutes, listening to the faint creak of the stairs. I heard the soft click of the front door. Then a distant car engine started far down the street. I sat up in the darkness, throwing the quilt aside. I shivered from pure, unadulterated anger. They thought I was weak. They had declared war. I reached under the bed and pulled the heavy lockbox out from the shadows. Now it was time. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the darkness of my bedroom, the heavy steel box resting on the floor beside my feet, waiting for the sun to rise. When the first pale streaks of morning light finally filtered through the blinds, I stood up. My joints ached, a reminder of my age and decades of hard labor. But my mind was sharper than it had been in years. The terrifying visit from Monica had stripped away any lingering doubts. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a calculated intrusion. I picked up the heavy lockbox and carried it downstairs to the kitchen. I placed it in the center of the heavy oak dining table. Then I walked out to the garage and retrieved my heaviest forged steel crowbar. When I returned to the kitchen, the morning sun was fully streaming through the glass patio doors, illuminating the thick layer of white plaster dust still clinging to the metal casing of the box. I set the flattened tip of the crowbar directly against the narrow gap between the heavy padlock and the reinforced steel latch. I wrapped my calloused hands around the cold metal shaft, took a deep breath, and threw my entire body weight into the lever. The metal groaned in protest. I adjusted my grip, planting my boots firmly against the hardwood floor, and pushed down again with every ounce of strength I had left in my old bones. For a moment, the box resisted. It was built to withstand intense fire and brutal force. But I had spent 40 years tearing down walls and breaking solid concrete. I knew exactly how to find the weak point of any structure. With a violent, high-pitched screech of tearing metal, the padlock bracket finally snapped. The heavy lock tumbled onto the oak table with a dull, heavy thud. I tossed the crowbar aside and reached for the lid. My hands were trembling slightly, not from the physical exertion, but from the crushing weight of what I was about to uncover. I slowly lifted the heavy lid back on its hinges. A faint smell of stale air and old paper drifted up from the dark interior. I stared down into the cavity of the box. It was not filled with old family photographs, sentimental love letters, or rusted jewelry tools like Jason had desperately claimed. Instead, resting on the dark velvet lining at the bottom of the fireproof safe were exactly 3 items. The first was a small, cheap plastic cell phone. It was a prepaid burner phone, the kind you buy with cash at a gas station, to avoid leaving any digital trace. The second item was a heavy black metal USB drive lying innocently next to the phone. And the third was a single piece of standard white printer paper folded neatly into thirds. My heart pounded a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs as I reached inside. I bypassed the electronics and carefully picked up the folded piece of paper. It felt crisp between my fingers, completely preserved by the airtight seal of the buried box. I slowly unfolded the document and smoothed it out flat on the wooden table. I recognized the formatting immediately. It was an internal banking ledger printed directly from the corporate accounting software we used at my commercial construction company. At the very top of the page, the name of my life's work was printed in bold black letters. But it was the columns of numbers below that made my breath catch in my throat. The entire page was a detailed transaction history spanning a single month. And scattered all the way down the right side of the page were thick, bright slashes of red highlighter ink. Evelyn had gone through this document line by line, marking specific recurring transfers with meticulous care. I traced my index finger over the red lines. On the 4th of the month, a wire transfer for $45,000. On the 12th, another wire for $62,000. On the 28th, an outgoing payment of $89,000. All of these massive withdrawals were being funneled directly out of our primary operating account. I dragged my gaze across the page to look at the final destination of these funds. Every single highlighted transaction was being routed into an external, unregistered, limited liability company called M Holdings. M Holdings. The letter M. I thought about Monica creeping through my bedroom in the dead of night. I thought about Jason aggressively trying to stop the electrician from tearing down the wall. My son, the boy I had sacrificed my entire physical well-being to protect, was systematically bleeding my company dry. Hundreds of thousands of dollars money meant to pay our honest, hard-working subcontractors, secure essential building materials, and fund my quiet retirement were being quietly siphoned away into a shadow account. And Evelyn had known. She had somehow bypassed the company's secure servers, printed out the damning evidence, and locked it away behind a wall of drywall and plaster. She was building a financial criminal case against her own son and his greedy wife. I sank into the wooden chair at the head of the table. The company I built with endless hours of grueling labor was being used to fund their lifestyle of luxury and deceit. Jason stood in my driveway yesterday, wearing a $15,000 watch, demanding a box he called trash. It was not trash. It was undeniable proof of his betrayal. I looked at the cheap burner phone and the black USB drive. The printed ledger was only the beginning. Evelyn had left me a map to their destruction. I picked up the black USB drive, feeling its cold weight. The sadness I had carried since her death was gone. In its place, a freezing anger took root. They had stolen my life's work. Now I was going to take everything back. I quickly gathered the ledger, the burner phone, and the black USB drive, shoving them deep into the pockets of my heavy flannel shirt. I carried the empty metal lockbox back upstairs, shoving it under my bed out of sight. I had barely made it back down to the kitchen to pour myself a cup of black coffee when the front doorbell chimed. I glanced at the digital clock on the microwave. It was barely 8 in the morning. I walked down the hallway, taking a slow, steadying breath to mask the freezing rage still coursing through my veins. I opened the heavy oak front door. Standing on my porch in the bright morning sunlight was my son Jason. He was not wearing his tailored navy suit today. Instead, he wore a casual, expensive cashmere sweater and slacks projecting the image of a relaxed, caring son dropping by for a weekend visit. In his hands, he carried a large brown paper bag from a high-end local bakery and a cardboard tray holding 2 large, steaming cups of artisan coffee. He flashed a warm, perfect smile that did not quite reach the corners of his eyes. "Dad," he said, his voice dripping with an unnatural, practiced sweetness. "Good morning. I brought your favorite, cinnamon raisin bagels and dark roast coffee. Can I come in?" I pushed the door open wider, stepping aside to let him pass. I forced my facial muscles to relax, letting my shoulders slump slightly, to play the part of the tired, grieving old man he expected to see. "Thank you, Jason," I murmured, keeping my voice low and raspy. "That is very thoughtful of you." We walked back into the kitchen. The thick layer of white plaster dust was still visible on the dining table from where I had cracked the safe open just an hour earlier. I saw Jason gaze lock onto the dust for a fraction of a second, a flicker of nervous energy passing behind his eyes, but he quickly ignored it. He set the bakery bag down on the granite island and handed me a cup of coffee. He pulled up a stool, leaning forward with his elbows on the counter, trying to establish a sense of intimate, familial warmth. "Dad, I wanted to come over this morning to apologize for yesterday." He began, his tone smooth and apologetic. "Monica and I were just under a lot of stress with the new commercial expansion project. We overreacted in the workshop. We know how much Mom meant to you, and we know being in that space is incredibly difficult for your emotional health." I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the heat burn the back of my throat. "It is fine, Jason," I said softly. "It has just been a long few days. I am just tired." He seized on that word immediately. Tired. His eyes lit up with a predatory gleam disguised as deep concern. "I know you are tired, Dad. You have been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders for decades. You built an incredible legacy from the dirt up, and then you lost Mom. You have never truly taken a moment to grieve, to just breathe, and let someone else carry the heavy lifting." He reached into the inside breast pocket of his cashmere sweater and pulled out a thick, glossy white envelope. He slid it slowly across the smooth granite countertop until it rested right in front of my hands. I looked down at it, playing my part perfectly. "What is this?" I asked, allowing my voice to waver just a little bit. "Open it," he urged, flashing that fake, triumphant smile again. I picked up the envelope and slid my thumb under the flap. Inside were 2 first-class plane tickets to Maui, Hawaii, along with a printed confirmation for a 2-week stay at a 5-star oceanfront resort. It was an incredibly expensive, lavish gift. A gift funded entirely by the money he was secretly siphoning out of my own accounts. "Jason, this is too much," I said, looking up at him with wide, seemingly bewildered eyes. "I cannot just pack up and leave. The house, the remodeling, the company." "That is exactly why I am here," Jason interrupted, reaching out and placing his soft hand over my calloused knuckles. "You need to rest, Dad. Let me handle the stress. You go sit on a beach, drink a cocktail, and watch the sunset. You deserve it more than anyone." As he spoke, he pulled a sleek black leather folder from his other pocket. He opened it, revealing a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper. At the very top, the bold black letters spelled out the words, "Durable Power of Attorney." My stomach turned to pure ice, but my face remained a mask of innocent confusion. "What are these papers, Jason?" I asked, squinting at the dense legal paragraphs, as if I could barely comprehend the complex terminology. "Oh, just standard administrative forms," he replied casually, waving his hand dismissively as if the documents were completely meaningless. "Since the bank appraisers are coming this week for the new commercial loan, I just need temporary authorization to sign a few municipal permits on your behalf while you are relaxing in Hawaii. It just saves us the trouble of trying to fax documents back and forth to your hotel. You know how those bank bureaucrats are. Just sign the bottom line, and I will take care of absolutely everything." I stared at the black ink pen he was offering me. If I signed that paper, I would be legally handing him the absolute power to liquidate every single asset I owned. I slowly reached out and took the plane tickets instead, pulling them close. "I need a few days to pack," I said quietly. Jason stood up, flashing a truly triumphant smile, and happily left my incredibly quiet house. I stood still in the kitchen until the sound of Jason's expensive car engine faded away down the street. The silence of the house settled around me again, but it was no longer a peaceful silence. It felt heavy, loaded with the dangerous reality of what my son had just attempted to do. I looked down at the 2 first-class plane tickets to Hawaii, resting on the granite countertop. They were not a gift. They were a calculated distraction. He wanted me 3,000 miles away, drinking cocktails on a beach, while he used that forged power of attorney to completely strip me of my life's work. I left the tickets on the counter, walked over to the front door, and engaged the deadbolt. I checked the back patio doors to ensure they were securely locked. I was not going to be caught off guard again. I reached into the deep pocket of my heavy flannel shirt and pulled out the cheap plastic burner phone I had retrieved from the lockbox earlier that morning. It felt remarkably light in my hand, almost like a child's toy compared to the heavy metal tools I was accustomed to holding. It was a simple, outdated flip phone, the kind you could buy with cash at any local pharmacy. I ran my thumb over the dusty plastic casing. I wondered if the internal battery still held any charge after being sealed behind a wall for over 2 years. I pressed my thumb firmly against the small rubber power button and held it down. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the small screen flickered to life, casting a harsh, pale blue light across my calloused palms. The battery indicator in the corner showed a single bar remaining. I had to work quickly before the device died completely. I navigated through the simplistic digital menu using the clunky arrow keys. I bypassed the call log and went straight into the messaging application. The inbox was completely empty. The sent folder was completely empty. But when I clicked on the folder labeled Drafts, a long list of unsent text messages populated the tiny screen. There were dozens of them, all typed out and saved but never transmitted. I opened the very first message at the top of the list. It was dated just 3 weeks before Evelyn passed away. The message read, "Richard, I do not know how to say this out loud yet, but I think Monica is in terrible financial trouble. I caught her going through the company mail today. When I asked her what she was looking for, she snapped at me. She lied about the new vendor invoices. Please look at the bank statements." I stared at the glowing blue text. Evelyn had always possessed an incredibly sharp intuition. While I spent my life looking at blueprints, structural load capacities, and profit margins, Evelyn looked at people. She could read a person's character within 5 minutes of shaking their hand. I remembered when Jason first brought Monica home for dinner 10 years ago. I thought she was charming and ambitious. But after they left, Evelyn had quietly washed the dishes, turned to me, and said there was something incredibly hollow about that girl. I had dismissed her concerns back then, assuming it was just the natural protectiveness of a mother handing over her only son. I had been a fool. I had been so busy building a financial empire for my family that I completely failed to see the rot spreading inside my own home. I pressed the down arrow key and opened the next saved draft. It was dated 4 days after the first one. The text read, "Richard, it is much worse than I thought. Jason is covering for her. I overheard them arguing in the driveway. She lost a massive amount of money in some offshore digital currency investment. She kept screaming that the market crashed. Jason told her not to panic and that he could move company funds to cover the margin calls before you noticed. He called you clueless. He said you were too old to understand digital ledgers." A sharp physical ache radiated through my chest as I read those words. My own son had called me clueless. He viewed my age and my unwavering trust in him as a weakness to be exploited. I opened another message. "Richard, I am scared. I found the M Holdings paperwork hidden in Jason's briefcase. They are setting up a shell company. I tried to confront Jason about it today, when Monica was not around, but he looked at me with such absolute coldness. He did not look like my boy anymore. He told me to stop snooping, or he would put me in a home. He actually threatened me. I am gathering the bank statements. I am going to put everything in a box. If anything happens to me, do not trust them. Do not sign anything." The blue light of the small screen blurred slightly as my eyes welled up with tears. For the past 2 years, I had carried a deep, quiet resentment, wondering why my beautiful wife would hide a locked safe inside her workshop wall. I had briefly shamefully wondered if she had a secret life of her own. But the truth was so much more heartbreaking. Evelyn did not hide that box because of her own sins. She hid it to protect me. She knew her health was failing. She knew she was not strong enough to fight them both in a brutal legal battle, so she used her final days to systematically gather the evidence I would need to defend myself. She built a shield for me, buried it in the bones of our house, and trusted that one day I would find it. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and closed the phone. They thought I was a clueless old man, but it was time to hunt. I walked back into the kitchen and stared at my smartphone resting on the granite counter. It was a sleek model Jason bought me last Christmas. I thought it was a generous gift. Now I realized it was a leash. He insisted on setting up family sharing applications, claiming it was for my safety in case of an emergency. If I took it today, he could track my exact location every second. I plugged the charging cable into the device, leaving it next to the fake Hawaiian tickets. Let him think I was resting at home. I slipped the plastic burner phone, the USB drive, and the bank ledger into my heavy canvas coat. I grabbed my spare keys, bypassed the automatic garage door, and slipped out the side access door. I walked 3 blocks to my secondary work truck, an old rusted Chevrolet I kept for hauling materials. It had no digital tracking and no connection to Jason. I climbed into the cab and started the engine. The drive into downtown Denver felt much longer than usual. Gray clouds rolled in over the Rocky Mountains, casting a dull, metallic light over the city. I drove past the shining glass skyscrapers where my son sat in his lavish corner office spending my stolen money. I kept driving, pushing further into the gritty industrial edge of the city. This was a place where the polished corporate facades gave way to cracked sidewalks, chain-link fences, and old brick warehouses. I was looking for a man named Bradley. 20 years ago, when my commercial construction company was rapidly expanding, I noticed a series of bizarre discrepancies in the billing invoices from one of our main structural steel suppliers. I hired Bradley, an independent forensic accountant, to look into the complicated numbers. He was not the kind of corporate accountant who wore a tailored suit or attended fancy networking dinners. He was a financial bloodhound. He dug through the supplier ledgers for 3 days without sleeping and uncovered a massive kickback scheme that saved my company from potential ruin. Bradley did not care about corporate politics or polite conversation. He only cared about the brutal, undeniable truth hidden inside the math. I pulled the old Chevrolet into a cramped, uneven parking lot, tucked between an abandoned auto repair shop and a faded brick office building. The building looked like it had not been renovated since the late 1980s. The thick paint around the window frames was peeling in long strips, and the glass was coated in a permanent layer of city grime. I parked the truck, pulled my collar up against the biting wind, and walked toward the heavy glass entrance door. The lobby was completely empty, smelling faintly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap floor wax. I walked up the narrow, creaking wooden staircase to the second floor and stopped in front of a frosted glass door with the name Bradley and Associates painted in faded black lettering. I gripped the cold brass handle, took a breath, and pushed the door open. The office inside was a chaotic landscape of towering paper stacks, overflowing cardboard storage boxes, and half-empty coffee cups. Behind a massive scarred wooden desk sat Bradley. He looked much older now, of course. His hair was completely gray and wild, and he wore a wrinkled button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He was hunched over a glowing computer monitor, rapidly typing on a mechanical keyboard with loud, sharp clacks. He stopped typing as the heavy door closed behind me. He looked up, peering through a pair of thick wire-rimmed glasses resting low on the bridge of his nose. He stared at me for a long, silent moment. The initial annoyance of being interrupted slowly vanished from his face, replaced by a sharp, calculating recognition. "Richard," he said, his voice dry and gravelly. "It has been a very long time. I heard about Evelyn passing away. I am truly sorry for your loss." I nodded once, appreciating that he did not offer any empty, drawn-out platitudes. "I did not come here for sympathy, Bradley." He leaned back in his squeaky leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. His sharp eyes scanned my face, taking in the deep exhaustion and the cold determination burning behind it. "You look like a man preparing to burn down his own house," he observed quietly. "What is going on?" I walked forward and stood directly in front of his cluttered desk. I reached into my thick canvas coat and pulled out the items. First, I placed the folded bank ledger onto a clear patch of the scarred wooden surface. I smoothed out the creases so the red highlighter marks Evelyn had made were clearly visible. Next, I pulled out the heavy black USB drive and set it down right beside the paper with a dull thud. Bradley leaned forward, his eyes immediately locking onto the columns of numbers and the highlighted wire transfers on the printed page. I saw his brilliant mind instantly begin to process the financial data, recognizing the pattern of systematic withdrawal. I looked him dead in the eyes, stripping away every ounce of fatherly protection I had ever carried for my only child. "My son has taken over my company," I said, my voice perfectly steady and ice cold. "He and his wife are hiding something massive. My wife found this before she died, and they are terrified of what else I might uncover. I need you to open that drive. I need you to track every single penny that left my accounts." Bradley reached out and picked up the black USB drive, turning it over in his fingers. He looked back up at me, sensing the absolute gravity of the request. "What exactly do you want me to do, Richard?" he asked. I placed my hands flat on his desk and leaned in. "I need you to dissect my son." Bradley did not blink. He did not offer any words of comfort or false reassurance. He simply nodded, his face hardening into a mask of pure professional focus. He reached out with pale, steady fingers and picked up the black metal USB drive. He plugged it into the side port of his heavy desktop computer. A faint chime echoed in the cramped office, signaling that the encrypted drive had been recognized. I pulled up a wooden chair with a cracked vinyl seat and sat down next to him, my eyes locked on the glowing monitor. The screen flickered for a brief second before a directory window popped open. There were 3 separate folders inside. The first one was simply labeled with a date from 2 years ago. Bradley double-clicked it. A massive spreadsheet filled the entire screen, accompanied by dozens of scanned PDF documents. Bradley leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes darting rapidly across the rows and columns. For 10 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the room was the heavy ticking of a wall clock and the rapid clicking of his mouse as he opened file after file. I watched the reflection of the data scrolling across his thick glasses. His expression grew darker with every passing minute. He let out a low, ragged sigh, resting his elbows on the desk and rubbing his temples. "Richard," Bradley said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, "I have seen a lot of corporate theft in my career, but this is incredibly aggressive. They did not just skim from the top of your operating accounts. They mortgaged your entire life." He turned the monitor slightly so I could see the screen. He pointed a pen at a scanned legal document. At the top of the page, the letters HELOC were printed in bold font. It was a home equity line of credit. But this was not a standard loan to fix a leaky roof. Bradley tapped the bottom of the page right next to a signature that looked identical to my own. "Your son and his wife forged your signature on these documents 18 months ago," Bradley explained, his tone clinical, but laced with underlying shock. "They used your commercial construction company as a primary guarantor, and they used your personal estate, the house you and Evelyn built, as the underlying collateral. They took out a $4.5 million line of credit against your properties." The air was instantly sucked out of my lungs. $4.5 million. It was a staggering, incomprehensible amount of money. I stared at the signature on the screen. It was a perfect forgery, capturing the exact slant and heavy pressure of my handwriting. Jason had spent decades watching me sign contracts and payroll checks. He knew exactly how to mimic my hand. "Where did the money go?" I asked, my voice sounding hollow and distant in my own ears. Bradley clicked on another document, bringing up a complex web of wire transfers. He traced his pen along a series of lines connecting my corporate bank accounts to the external entity Evelyn had found. It all funneled directly into M Holdings. I dug into the corporate registry for this LLC while you were sitting there. M Holdings is a private shell company registered in the state of Delaware. The sole managing director is Monica. He opened a third file revealing a series of chaotic, erratic financial statements. Once the money hit her private account, she did not invest it in real estate or traditional stocks. She dumped the entire $4.5 million into a highly volatile offshore cryptocurrency exchange. Bradley shook his head, a look of absolute disgust crossing his weathered face. She was day trading with Leverage Richard. She was making massive unhedged bets on digital coins chasing rapid wealth. And when the market crashed last year, she was hit with catastrophic margin calls. Her positions were completely liquidated. I sat in the uncomfortable wooden chair, letting the sheer magnitude of the betrayal wash over me. Monica had gambled away my entire life savings on invisible digital tokens. And when she lost everything, Jason had panicked. He had abused his position of trust within my company to forge the loan documents covering her massive debts to prevent the offshore brokers from coming after their personal assets. They had effectively transferred all of their catastrophic financial liabilities directly onto my shoulders without me ever knowing. The bank appraiser, I muttered, the puzzle pieces suddenly snapping together in my mind with terrifying clarity. Jason was at my house this morning. He told me the bank was sending an appraiser to evaluate the property for a new commercial expansion. Bradley looked at me grimly. There is no commercial expansion, Richard. The bank is sending an appraiser because the massive monthly interest payments on this $4.5 million loan have dried up. Your company operating accounts are completely drained. They have missed the last 3 payments. The bank is preparing to foreclose. They are going to seize your business, your equipment, and your family home. The reality of my situation settled over me like a suffocating blanket of heavy lead. I was technically bankrupt. The empire I had built with 40 years of sweat-broken bones and grueling labor was completely gone, vaporized by the reckless greed of a daughter-in-law I had welcomed to my dinner table and the cowardice of a son I had sworn to protect. If I did nothing, the bank would take my home within the month. I would be thrown out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on my back. Jason had tried to hand me plane tickets to Hawaii this morning, so I would be 3,000 miles away when the bank finally arrived to lock the doors. I looked down at my rough, calloused hands. They were trembling with a deep, dark fury. I was finally ready. Bradley did not say another word. He reached for the mouse and closed the spreadsheet detailing my financial ruin. I watched the cursor slowly hover over the second folder on the USB drive. He double-clicked it. The folder opened to reveal a single audio file. There were no documents, no scanned pages, just a basic sound recording. Bradley clicked the play button, leaned back in his leather chair, and increased the volume on his desktop speakers. A few seconds of static filled the cramped office, followed by someone taking a deep, shuddering breath. Then my wife began to speak. Richard, if you are listening to this, it means I am gone and you found the box. Hearing Evelyn speak after 2 years of silence was like being struck by lightning. Her voice was not the strong, vibrant sound I remembered. It was frail, trembling with exhaustion and deep, agonizing sorrow. I closed my eyes, letting her voice wash over me, feeling a sudden, suffocating tightness in my chest. I could picture her sitting alone in that dusty workshop, holding a cheap microphone, terrified of the walls around her. Listen carefully, Richard, she continued, her voice breaking. You cannot trust anyone, especially Jason. I know it breaks your heart, but our son is not the boy we raised. He is desperate. Monica ruined them financially, and Jason is terrified of going to prison for the corporate fraud he committed to cover her tracks. The bank is going to come for the house, and Jason knows that once you find out about the loan, you will destroy him. You will take back control and hand him over to the authorities. He cannot let that happen. A heavy pause followed. I could hear a faint sniffle, the sound of my wife wiping away tears in the dark. Jason is planning to declare you mentally incompetent to seize control of the remaining assets, Evelyn said, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. I overheard them talking in the driveway late at night. They have already paid a corrupt private psychiatrist to write a fake medical evaluation. They are going to claim that you are suffering from severe dementia. They will say your grief over my passing has completely detached you from reality. Jason is going to use that fake diagnosis to petition a judge for full medical and financial guardianship over you. They want to strip you of your legal rights. They want to lock you away in a facility so you cannot testify against them when the fraud is discovered. You have to stop them. You cannot sign anything Jason gives you. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening force. The power of attorney document. Jason had tried to push into my hands just a few hours ago over breakfast. The fake warm smile. The first-class plane tickets to Hawaii. It was all a carefully orchestrated trap. If I had signed that paper, I would have handed him the blade to slit my own throat. He would have drained my personal checking accounts, finalized the fraudulent medical records, and by the time I returned, my own home would have been locked to me. I would have been legally erased from my own life. I am so sorry, Richard. Evelyn sobbed on the recording, the sound of her weeping cutting through the office like a physical blade. This is my fault. It is all my fault. You were always working so hard to build our life to provide for us, and I spoiled him. I protected him from your discipline. I gave him everything he asked for because I wanted him to have a perfect childhood. I turned him into a weak, selfish man who only cares about his own survival. I raised a monster, Richard, and now that monster is coming for you. Please forgive me. Please protect yourself. I love you so much. The audio ended with a soft click followed by dead static. Bradley reached out and turned off the speakers. The silence in the cramped office was absolute thick with the heavy weight of a dead mother's final confession. I sat perfectly still in the cracked vinyl chair. For the first 2 minutes, I allowed the grief to wash over me. I allowed myself to feel the profound tragedy of my beautiful wife spending her final weeks drowning in terror, desperately trying to build a legal shield for her husband, because she knew her own son was a predator. But the grief did not last. It burned away under the intense heat of a completely different emotion. I opened my eyes and looked at my hands on my knees. The trembling had stopped. My knuckles were white, my jaw clenched so tightly that my teeth ached. My sadness was entirely gone, replaced by an ice-cold, calculating rage. Jason had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Stealing my money was a crime of greed. Forging my signature was an act of extreme cowardice. But conspiring to strip me of my human dignity, plotting to lock me inside a psychiatric ward while I was of sound mind just so he could escape the consequences of his own actions, that was a declaration of absolute war. He had looked me in the eyes this morning, handed me my coffee, and smiled while holding the paperwork that would end my life as a free man. I looked up at Bradley. He was watching me closely, reading the shift in my posture. "Do you have a lawyer you trust?" I asked, my voice no longer hollow. It was sharp and authoritative. Someone who knows how to draw blood in a courtroom. Bradley nodded slowly. "I know exactly who to call. What is our next move?" "We are not just going to stop them," I replied, my voice echoing in the small room. "Open the third file on that drive. Let us see what my wife left for us." I told Bradley to replay the last 10 seconds of the recording. I needed to hear if Evelyn had dropped any specific details about the psychiatrist they were planning to use. He clicked the mouse and the frail voice of my wife filled the room once more. She did not say a name, but she mentioned a specific private clinic located on the outskirts of Boulder. Bradley immediately minimized the audio player and opened a new search window. His fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with practiced speed. He bypassed standard public search engines and logged directly into a restricted financial database he used to track corporate vendor payments. If Jason was paying off a corrupt doctor, Bradley reasoned he would not be stupid enough to write a personal check. He would hide the payments inside the complex daily operations of the construction company, burying them under a mountain of legitimate subcontractor invoices. Bradley opened the corporate ledger we had reviewed earlier and ran a digital filter specifically targeting consulting fees and independent health assessments processed over the last 6 months. The screen populated with hundreds of transactions. He filtered it again, isolating payments made to any medical facilities in the Boulder area. A single line of data remained highlighted on the glowing monitor. It was a recurring monthly payment of $12,000 listed under the vague category of executive wellness consulting. The receiving entity was a private psychiatric practice registered to a Dr. Mitchell Carver. Bradley highlighted the name and opened another secure database, this one connected to state medical licensing boards and malpractice registries. He typed the name of the doctor into the search bar and hit enter. Within seconds, a disturbing professional profile appeared on the screen. Dr. Mitchell Carver was not a respected pillar of the medical community. He had a suspended license in 2 neighboring states for unethical prescribing practices and had been investigated multiple times for providing fraudulent psychological evaluations in high-stakes divorce settlements and corporate inheritance disputes. He was a hired gun, a man who would rubber stamp any medical diagnosis if the price was right. Jason had found the absolute perfect accomplice for his sinister plan. Bradley did not stop there. He wanted to see exactly what Jason was buying with my stolen money. He accessed a digital portal used by insurance companies to verify patient diagnoses. Using my social security number and basic personal information, Bradley initiated a secure search to see if any new medical records had been filed under my name in the state registry. The loading icon spun for what felt like an eternity. When the page finally refreshed, a massive, densely typed medical file appeared on the screen. It bore the official letterhead of Dr. Carver. Bradley opened the attached document and began to read the clinical notes out loud. The words hit me like physical blows. According to this completely fabricated medical record, I had been suffering from severe, rapidly progressing dementia for the past 2 years. The report claimed I experienced frequent visual hallucinations, severe memory gaps, and terrifying episodes of violent paranoia. It stated that I was incapable of managing my own basic hygiene, let alone a multi-million-dollar commercial construction company. It concluded with a strong medical recommendation that I be immediately transitioned into a secure, locked memory care facility for my own physical safety. I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice. I had never even met this man. I had never stepped foot inside his clinic. Yet here was a legally binding medical document signed and notarized by a licensed psychiatrist declaring my mind completely broken. Jason and Monica had constructed an alternate reality, a perfectly documented lie designed to strip me of my human rights. The terrifying genius of their plan suddenly became crystal clear. The power of attorney document. Jason had so casually slid across my kitchen counter this morning was not just a temporary measure to sign municipal building permits. It was the final lethal piece of their trap. If I had signed that paper, I would have legally surrendered my autonomy. And the first-class plane tickets to Hawaii were not a gift to help me grieve. They were a calculated method of extraction. If I had boarded that flight, I would have landed in Maui, thousands of miles away from my home, my friends, and my business. Jason would have immediately taken that signed power of attorney, combined it with the fraudulent medical evaluation, and marched straight into a judge's chambers. He would have filed for emergency guardianship, presenting himself as the tragic, loving son forced to take control of his deeply unwell father's estate. The judge, looking at the forged signature and the official medical diagnosis, would have granted it without a second thought. By the time my 2-week vacation was over, I would not have had a home to return to. My bank accounts would have been entirely frozen and legally transferred to the control of Jason. My credit cards would have been canceled. When I stepped off the return flight in Denver, Jason would not have been waiting at the baggage claim to welcome me back. Instead, an orderly from a locked psychiatric facility would have been waiting with a medical transport van armed with a court order to detain me. I would have been locked in a sterile white room screaming that I was perfectly sane, which is exactly what a paranoid dementia patient would do. My own protests would have only cemented the fake diagnosis. I would have died in that facility entirely alone while Jason and Monica lived like royalty in the house I built. They had planned every single detail with cold, mechanical precision. The trap was fully set, and I had been standing just one signature away from stepping right into the jaws of it. I took a deep breath, letting the freezing anger settle permanently into my bones. I was ready. I did not pick up the phone to call Jason. I did not storm into his lavish corner office to flip his heavy mahogany desk and demand an explanation. A younger version of myself, the man who used to break up fights on active construction sites with his bare hands, would have driven straight to that corporate high-rise and dragged him out by his expensive collar. But physical violence and screaming matches were exactly what he expected from me. He wanted me to act erratic. He wanted me to look unhinged so he could point to my outrage as further proof of my fabricated dementia. I refused to give him that satisfaction. He was anticipating a confused, broken old man who would simply fold under pressure. I told Bradley that I wanted total, absolute destruction. I wanted to dismantle their lives with the exact same cold, clinical precision they had used to dismantle mine. I did not just want to save my money. I wanted to ensure they never had the opportunity to prey on anyone else ever again. Bradley nodded in silent agreement, reaching for his desk phone to make the first crucial call. He dialed the personal cell phone number of a man named Marcus Reed. Marcus was not just a lawyer. He was a former federal prosecutor who now ran his own private firm, specializing in aggressive corporate litigation and complex white-collar defense. 10 years ago, my company built his law office, and I had personally overseen the construction from the foundation to the roof. He owed me a massive favor, and I was calling it in today. Within an hour, Marcus walked through the frosted glass door of the shabby office. He did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. He took off his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and immediately began reviewing the forged loan documents and the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation Bradley had pulled from the database. His face hardened as he read the fabricated clinical notes. For the next 5 hours, the cramped room transformed into a war room. We drafted a massive stack of binding legal documents. I signed temporary restraining orders, emergency injunctions, and strict cease and desist letters. We prepared a direct petition to the State Medical Board to immediately revoke Dr. Carver's medical license and launch a criminal investigation into his entire practice, ensuring that the corrupt psychiatrist would never practice medicine again. Then Marcus drew up the paperwork necessary to sever Jason completely from my company. I signed documents revoking all his corporate privileges, canceling his access to the corporate servers, and terminating his position as the managing director. But we did not file them. Not yet. If we filed them right now, Jason would receive an automated digital notification giving him time to panic transfer funds or destroy critical evidence. We needed to wait for the absolute perfect moment to strike. I wanted the blade to fall when he was completely exposed, surrounded by the very people he was trying to impress with my stolen wealth. Once the corporate documents were finalized, Marcus reached out to his former colleagues at the federal level. He placed a secure call directly to the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Because we possessed concrete, undeniable proof of a multi-million-dollar bank fraud crossing state lines involving forged signatures and illegal wire transfers, the federal agents moved with terrifying speed. They opened a massive, quiet investigation into Jason and Monica. They began tracking the flow of the stolen money from my operating accounts into the offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. The final nail in the financial coffin was securing the secret freeze on Monica's private shell company. Marcus contacted a federal judge he knew intimately, presenting the mountain of forensic evidence Bradley had compiled over the afternoon. By 4 o'clock, a secret federal injunction was quietly placed on M Holdings. Every single bank account, routing number, and digital wallet associated with Monica's name was completely frozen. She could not withdraw a single penny. She could not transfer a dime. She was completely locked out of her own stolen fortune, but the banking institutions would not notify her until the next business day. She was walking around thinking she was a wealthy mastermind, completely unaware that she was already financially ruined and legally trapped. But I knew Jason was a desperate, dangerous man. If he somehow caught wind of our covert investigation before the trap finally sprang, he might try to accelerate his plan to have me locked away in the psychiatric ward. To counter this looming threat, Marcus helped me establish a highly secure digital dead man's switch. We placed every single piece of evidence, the financial ledgers, the forged signature documents, the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation, and the heartbreaking audio recording of my late wife onto a secure automated server network. If I did not physically log into that server and enter a specific password every 12 hours, the system would automatically email the entire unredacted dossier to every major news outlet in Denver, the local police chief, and the entire board of directors at the commercial bank. No matter what happened to me, the truth would detonate and destroy them completely, leaving no room for escape. By the time the sun began to set over the city skyline, the massive legal arsenal was fully prepared. I stood up from the cracked vinyl chair, my joints stiff but my mind razor-sharp. I had walked into this office as a victim, a grieving widower, on the verge of losing everything he had ever built. I was walking out as the architect of their complete and utter destruction. I thanked Bradley, and Marcus carefully tucked the newly signed legal documents deeply into my heavy canvas coat and walked slowly back out into the cold evening air toward my reliable old truck. The hunt had officially begun, and I was going to enjoy every single second of their downfall. I had just reached the driver's side door of my rusted Chevrolet and pulled the heavy metal handle when the cheap plastic burner phone in my coat pocket began to vibrate aggressively. I froze, the cold evening wind whipping across the desolate parking lot. Only one person had this phone number. I pulled the device out and pressed the green button, pressing the small speaker against my ear. It was Bradley. His voice was no longer the steady clinical tone of a forensic accountant. It was tight-laced with a sudden urgent tension. He told me to turn around and get back up to the office immediately. He said he had found something else, something buried so deeply inside the digital architecture of the USB drive that his initial security sweep had completely missed it. I locked the truck and walked back toward the faded brick building, my heart pounding, a heavy rhythm against my ribs. I took the wooden stairs 2 at a time, ignoring the dull ache in my knees. When I pushed the frosted glass door open, Marcus was standing behind Bradley, both men staring in absolute silence at the glowing computer monitor. I walked over and stood beside them, my eyes scanning the screen. Bradley pointed a trembling finger at a small gray icon resting at the bottom corner of his directory window. He explained that when he went to safely eject the USB drive from his system, his security software flagged an anomaly in the storage capacity. The drive was advertised as holding 64 gigabytes of data, but the folders we had reviewed only accounted for a fraction of that space. Bradley had run a deep diagnostic scan and discovered a hidden, heavily encrypted partition built directly into the core code of the drive. Evelyn had not just dumped her evidence onto a flash drive. She had deliberately buried a specific file behind military-grade encryption, ensuring that even if Jason had somehow found the metal lockbox, he would never possess the technical skills required to access this final piece of the puzzle. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Bradley did not look away from the monitor. "It is a massive video file," he replied, "and it is locked behind a complex alphanumeric passcode. But your wife was not a computer programmer, Richard. She used a commercial encryption software, which means the foundational architecture has vulnerabilities I can exploit. I am running a brute force decryption script right now. It is testing thousands of character combinations every single second." The three of us stood in the cramped, dimly lit office, the silence broken only by the aggressive whirring of the computer cooling fan and the rapid rhythmic clicking of the mechanical keyboard. On the screen, a green progress bar crept forward, at an agonizingly slow pace. I stared at the lines of code scrolling rapidly across the black command window, feeling a terrible sense of dread settling in the pit of my stomach. Evelyn had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide the financial ledgers and the audio warning. But she had gone to even greater lengths to hide this video. Whatever was waiting on the other side of that encryption wall was the true reason she had torn open the physical structure of our workshop and bolted a fireproof safe to the foundational beams of our home. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Marcus crossed his arms, his jaw clenched tight. Bradley leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes reflecting the rapidly changing text. Then a sharp, high-pitched chime echoed from the desktop speakers. The black command window vanished. The green progress bar disappeared. In their place, a single digital folder popped open on the center of the screen. The decryption was successful. Inside the folder was a single media file formatted as an MP4 video. Bradley reached for his mouse. His hand hovered over the icon for a long moment before he looked up at me. "Are you ready for this?" he asked quietly. I nodded once, my throat too tight to form words. He double-clicked the file. A media player opened, expanding to fill the entire monitor. For a brief second, the screen was pitch black. Then a grainy, high-definition image flickered to life. The camera angle was positioned high up near the ceiling, looking down at a wide downward angle. I recognized the room instantly. It was the interior of Evelyn's jewelry workshop. The heavy wooden workbench was situated directly in the center of the frame, covered in silver wire polishing cloths and small hand tools. The lighting was dim, illuminated only by the small desk lamp clamped to the edge of the table. My breath caught in my throat, choking off the air to my lungs. I reached out and gripped the edge of Bradley's wooden desk to steady myself. Evelyn was not just a talented jeweler. She was a meticulous planner. Sometime during those final, terrifying weeks when she realized her own son was plotting to destroy our lives, she had quietly purchased and installed a hidden security camera in the top corner of her sanctuary. She had angled it perfectly to capture the entire workspace and the main entrance door. But it was not the hidden camera that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was the digital timestamp glowing in stark white numbers at the bottom right corner of the video playback. I stared at the date and the time ticking forward on the screen. It was a Tuesday evening in late November, exactly 2 years ago. The time displayed was 8:45 in the evening. I knew that exact date. I knew that exact hour. It was a time permanently burned into the darkest corners of my memory. It was the exact night that I found my wife dead from a sudden heart attack. I watched the screen, my breath catching in my throat. The video playback started with an eerie stillness. For the first few seconds, the only movement on the screen was the gentle swaying of the small desk lamp swinging slightly on its metal hinge. Then my wife walked into the frame. Evelyn looked so incredibly frail. She was wearing her thick blue woolen sweater, the one she always draped over her shoulders when the Denver winter crept through the poorly insulated walls of the workshop. She walked over to the heavy wooden workbench and sat down on her wooden stool. Her movements were slow, burdened by the failing health we had both tried so hard to ignore during those final months. But despite her physical weakness, there was a rigid, unyielding determination in her posture. She reached into her canvas tote bag and pulled out a thick stack of papers. Even through the grainy resolution of the hidden camera, I could clearly see the bright red highlighter marks bleeding through the pages. It was the bank ledger. The exact same ledger I now carried in the pocket of my coat. She arranged the papers deliberately across the surface of the workbench, spreading them out like a prosecutor preparing for a massive trial. Then she simply sat there and waited. The timestamp on the bottom corner of the video ticked forward. 3 minutes passed in absolute agonizing silence. I watched her hands trembling slightly as she rested them on her lap. I wanted to reach through the glass of the computer monitor and hold her. I wanted to tell her that she did not have to fight this terrible battle entirely alone. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door of the workshop swung open violently. 2 figures marched into the frame. It was Jason and Monica. They were dressed in expensive evening clothes, likely returning from one of their lavish corporate dinners funded entirely by my stolen money. Jason looked visibly annoyed, his jaw set in a tight, impatient line. Monica stood slightly behind him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, glaring at my wife with open hostility. The audio on the recording was muffled, buried under the low hum of the workshop space heater, but the body language was deafening. Evelyn did not stand up to greet them. She simply raised a trembling finger and pointed directly at the bank ledgers spread across the table. Jason stepped forward, leaning over the workbench to look at the documents. I watched his posture shift instantly. The arrogant annoyance melted away, replaced by a sudden, rigid shock. He recognized the ledgers. He knew exactly what she had found. He took a step back, shaking his head rapidly, holding his hands up in a defensive posture. Through the faint, crackling audio, I could barely make out the frantic tone of his voice. He was denying it. He was trying to spin his usual web of lies, probably claiming the transfers were legitimate corporate investments or tax mitigation strategies. But Evelyn was not me. She did not have my blind spot for our son. She stood up from the stool, her small frame radiating a sudden, fierce energy. She grabbed the papers and shoved them directly into his chest. She was shouting now. I could not hear the specific words, but I could see the absolute heartbreak and furious disappointment twisting her beautiful face. She was confronting him with the undeniable reality of his theft. She was demanding the truth. Jason threw the papers back onto the table. His defensive posture vanished, morphing into aggressive intimidation. He took a menacing step toward his mother, towering over her frail form. He pointed his finger directly in her face, his mouth moving rapidly in a vicious, hateful tirade. He was threatening her. He was likely telling her about his plan to declare me mentally incompetent, trying to terrify her into permanent silence. What happened next made my breath stop completely. I watched in absolute disbelief as the situation escalated beyond any boundary of human decency. Evelyn, the woman who had spent her entire life nurturing and protecting her only child, drew her hand back and slapped Jason straight across the face. The sharp, cracking sound of the impact echoed clearly through the muffled audio. It was a strike fueled by decades of wasted sacrifice and profound betrayal. Jason stumbled backward, his hand flying up to his cheek. He looked completely stunned, his eyes wide with absolute shock. He simply could not comprehend that his gentle mother had finally fought back. But the shock only lasted for a fraction of a second. Before Jason could even react, Monica lunged forward. She shoved past her husband and aggressively closed the distance between herself and my wife. Monica leaned directly into Evelyn's personal space, her face contorted into a mask of pure, vicious rage. She was screaming at the top of her lungs, her neck straining with the force of her absolute hatred. She pointed aggressively at the door, then back at Evelyn, her gestures violent and unpredictable. She looked like she was completely ready to strike a dying woman with her bare hands. The tension radiating from the computer screen was entirely unbearable. My hands were shaking so violently that I had to grip the edge of Bradley's wooden desk just to keep myself upright. I slowly reached out with my right hand and pressed my calloused fingertips against the cold, flat glass of the monitor. I traced the grainy outline of my wife's face. I was watching the final terrifying moments of her life unfold in front of me, completely powerless to stop it from happening again. Evelyn was trapped. She was backed against the heavy wooden workbench, surrounded by the two people who had systematically destroyed her family. Monica continued to scream, stepping even closer, her aggressive posture forcing Evelyn to lean backward awkwardly over the table to avoid physical contact. I watched my wife's chest begin to heave heavily. Her breathing became rapid, shallow, and incredibly labored. Suddenly, my wife raised her right hand and pressed it flat against the center of her chest. The anger that had fueled her just moments before vanished entirely, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated physical agony. Her knees buckled beneath her. She grabbed the heavy wooden edge of the workbench to keep herself from falling, but her strength was rapidly failing. She collapsed onto her knees, her shoulder hitting the thick wooden leg of the table. Even through the grainy, silent footage, the sheer terror in her eyes was piercing. She was having a massive heart attack. Jason instantly froze. The aggressive posture he had maintained during the argument evaporated. He took a hesitant step forward, his hands hovering in the air, completely paralyzed by sudden panic. He recognized what was happening. He had been there 5 years ago, during her first mild cardiac episode. He knew exactly how fragile her heart truly was. Evelyn lifted her trembling left hand and pointed frantically toward the far corner of the workbench. Sitting right next to her silver polishing cloths was a small translucent orange plastic bottle. It was her prescription nitroglycerin, the medication specifically designed to open her arteries and stop a cardiac event in its tracks. All she needed was a single pill under her tongue to survive. She reached her arm up, her fingers blindly scraping against the wooden surface, desperately trying to pull herself up high enough to reach the life-saving medication. She missed the bottle by mere inches. Her hand slipped, and she fell completely to the floor, clutching her chest as her body curled into a tight, agonizing ball. Jason finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He lunged forward, his eyes locked on the orange bottle resting on the table. He reached his hand out to grab the medication to save his mother, but his fingers never touched the plastic. Before Jason could reach the pills, Monica moved. She stepped forward with terrifying speed and slammed her hand firmly around his wrist. The physical impact jerked Jason backward. He turned to look at his wife, his face twisted in absolute confusion and desperate panic. He tried to pull his arm free, gesturing frantically toward his dying mother on the floor. Monica did not let go. She tightened her grip, stepping directly into his line of sight, blocking him from the workbench entirely. She shook her head. It was a slow, deliberate, and incredibly calculated movement. Through the muffled audio of the hidden camera, I could hear the faint sound of her voice. She was speaking to him in a low, intense whisper. She was telling him to stop. She was telling him that if Evelyn survived this medical emergency, she would go straight to the police with the bank ledgers. She was convincing my son that the only way to save their own lives, to keep their stolen money, and avoid a federal prison sentence was to let his mother die. Jason began to weep. His shoulders shook violently as the horrifying reality of her words washed over him. He looked down at Evelyn, who was now gasping for air, her face pale, her eyes begging her son for help. Jason took a weak step toward her, but his resolve was completely broken. He was a coward. He had always been a coward. Monica did not wait for him to make a final decision. She released his wrist, turned around, and looked directly at the small orange bottle sitting on the wooden surface. She raised her right arm and coldly swept her hand across the table. The plastic pill bottle flew off the edge of the workbench. It bounced off the hard floorboards and rolled deep into the dark shadows beneath the heavy metal radiator, completely out of reach. My heart stopped beating in my chest. I stopped breathing. I watched my daughter-in-law actively murder my wife, not with a weapon, but with a simple, devastating omission of basic human decency. Evelyn saw the bottle disappear into the darkness. I watched her body go completely limp as she realized the horrifying truth. Her own son was going to let her die to cover up his theft. Monica grabbed Jason by the lapels of his expensive suit jacket. She pulled him violently toward the heavy wooden door of the workshop. Jason stumbled backward like a broken puppet, tears streaming down his face, his hands covering his mouth to muffle his own panicked sobbing. He could not even bear to look back at the floor. Monica pushed him out into the cold night air. Before she followed him, she stopped in the doorway. She turned back and stared at my wife lying in the dust. There was no remorse on her face. There was only the cold calculation of a predator who had just eliminated her only threat. Monica reached her hand out and flipped the wall switch. The small desk lamp turned off. The overhead lights shut down. The entire workshop plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The heavy wooden door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the computer speakers with a heavy final thud. The video continued to record in the dark. I sat in the cramped office staring at the black monitor, listening to the faint, terrible sounds of my wife struggling to breathe alone in the freezing workshop. The sounds grew weaker and weaker over the next few minutes, until there was nothing but the steady, mechanical hum of the space heater. They had left her in the dark to die. They had walked back into my house, crawled into my guest bed, and waited for me to wake up the next morning and find her body. I wiped a single cold tear from my cheek. I slowly stood up. My grief vanished entirely, replaced by a need for retribution. I just looked at Bradley. He sat perfectly still, staring at the screen. The time for mercy was gone. The screen faded into a static gray. Bradley leaned back in his squeaking leather chair, running a trembling hand over his face. Despite his career wading through the darkest corners of corporate greed, the sheer cruelty of what we had witnessed left him entirely speechless. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and unspoken sympathy. He expected me to shatter, to finally break through the dam, leaving a weeping, broken mess on his office floor. But the tears did not come. My eyes remained dry. The suffocating sorrow weighing down my chest for 2 years evaporated. A terrifying clarity took hold of my mind. The grieving widower was dead. The father who broke his body providing for his only son was dead. Jason and Monica killed him the moment they knocked that orange bottle onto the floor. I was no longer just a father. I was now an executioner. I stood up. My posture was perfectly straight. The ache in my knees vanished, replaced by an absolute focus. I looked at the dark monitor one last time before turning to the 2 men in the room. Marcus finally broke the silence. "Richard," he started, his voice thick with anger. "This is no longer just a fraud case. This is criminal negligence resulting in death. This is manslaughter. We need to take this flash drive to the district attorney right now. We can have them arrested before midnight." I shook my head. "No," I said, perfectly calm and stripped of hesitation. "If we arrest them tonight, they will simply be dragged out in the dark. They will hire expensive attorneys with the money they stole. They will spin a narrative claim it was an accident and settle behind closed doors. They murdered my wife in the shadows. I am going to destroy them in the absolute brightest light possible." Bradley adjusted his thick glasses, leaning forward. "What exactly are you proposing, Richard?" I walked over to the desk and leaned in close. "This Friday evening, Jason and Monica are hosting a corporate event at the Grand Ballroom. They are calling it the M Holdings 10th Anniversary Gala. It is a complete fabrication. M Holdings has not existed for 10 years, but they are using the milestone of my construction company to legitimize their shell corporation in front of every major investor and bank executive in Denver. Jason has been planning this extravagant party for months, using my stolen funds to pay for premium champagne and a live orchestra." Marcus nodded slowly. "He invited you. He insisted that I attend." I replied, a cold smile touching my mouth. "He told me he wanted to honor my legacy. But we know the real reason. He wants to use that stage to publicly announce my retirement due to declining cognitive health. He wants to solidify his absolute control while parading me around as a confused prop before locking me away in that psychiatric ward. I am going to attend that gala. I am going to put on my best tailored suit, walk into that ballroom, and play the role of the proud, supportive father. And when Jason calls me up to the stage to hand over the reins of my empire, I am going to give a speech they will never forget." Marcus crossed his arms, a predatory gleam appearing in his eyes. "You want to play the video?" "I do not just want to play it," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I want it projected onto the massive 20-foot screen behind the main podium. I want the audio patched directly into the primary sound system so every single person in that ballroom can hear the sound of my wife slapping his face. I want the bank executives who approved that fraudulent $4.5 million loan to watch him let his own mother die on the floor. I want their entire world, their reputation, their freedom, and their stolen wealth to burn to ashes in front of an audience. Bradley let out a long breath, a grim smile breaking through his horrified expression. The audio-visual team handling the gala was hired through a third-party vendor. I know the contractor. I can get one of my own technicians inside the control booth. We can hijack the main feed right from the presentation laptop. Jason will not even know it is happening until it is too late. Marcus reached for his phone, his fingers already dialing his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And I will make sure the federal agents and local homicide detectives are waiting in the hotel lobby. The moment that video finishes playing, they will seal the exits. There will be no quiet surrender. It will be a completely public spectacle. I looked down at the black USB drive resting on the desk. It was the digital tombstone of my marriage, but it was also the weapon that would deliver absolute justice. Jason thought his old, tired father was too slow, too consumed by grief to ever see the knife coming. He was about to learn a terrifying lesson about the man who gave him life. Richard, Bradley said quietly, "This is going to be incredibly difficult for you to watch again, especially in a room full of people. Are you absolutely sure you want to do it this way?" I turned and looked out the grimy window of the office, staring into the dark storm clouds over the city. I thought about Evelyn lying alone on that cold floor, taking her last agonizing breaths in the pitch-black workshop. I thought about the sheer evil required to turn off the lights on a dying woman. I thought about how she must have felt knowing her own blood had abandoned her. "I am absolutely sure," I replied, turning back to face them. "I do not just want my money back. I want them in orange jumpsuits." 3 days passed in a blur. By Friday evening, the freezing anger inside me had hardened into a sharp diamond. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom, adjusting the dark silk tie of my best charcoal suit. It was the same suit I had worn to my wife's funeral. Tonight, I was wearing it to bury my son. I left the quiet house and drove through the cool Denver evening, toward the most luxurious 5-star hotel in the heart of the city. When I pulled up to the grand entrance, a valet in a crisp uniform took my keys. I walked through the towering glass doors and followed the soft sounds of a live string quartet, guiding me toward the grand ballroom. The doors to the event space were wide open, revealing a scene of staggering extravagance. Crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring ceiling, casting a warm glow over hundreds of guests. Waiters in white gloves circulated seamlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of premium imported champagne and expensive appetizers. In the very center of the room, surrounded by an elaborate display of rare orchids, stood a massive ice sculpture. It was carved into the shape of a towering letter M, the fake corporate logo for their fraudulent shell company. I stood at the edge of the room, taking it all in. Every single drop of champagne, every delicate flower petal, and every note played by the orchestra was paid for with the money Jason had stolen from my construction company. It was paid for with the fraudulent bank loan that was about to cost me my home. And worst of all, it was paid for with the life of the woman I loved. I scanned the crowded room and spotted the architects of my misery. Jason and Monica were standing near the main stage, holding court like absolute royalty. Jason wore a bespoke black tuxedo. He held a glass of amber scotch in one hand, gesturing expansively with the other as he spoke to a tight circle of wealthy investors. He threw his head back and laughed loudly at a joke, projecting the perfect image of a fearless young corporate titan. Monica stood closely beside him, draped in a stunning floor-length emerald green designer gown that sparkled under the chandelier light. She smiled radiantly, resting her hand gently on Jason's arm, playing the role of the devoted wife. They were completely surrounded by the very banking executives and commercial loan officers they had systematically defrauded just 18 months prior. The sheer audacity of their performance was almost hypnotic. They were standing in a room full of people they had lied to spending money They did not earn celebrating a company that produced absolutely nothing but deceit. They felt entirely invincible. They believed their meticulous plan was flawless, and that by the end of the night they would possess total control over my entire life's work. As I walked slowly across the plush carpet of the ballroom, Jason finally noticed me approaching. The loud, arrogant laugh instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of deep manufactured concern. He whispered something quickly into Monica's ear, and the two of them excused themselves from the group of bankers to intercept me before I could mingle with the crowd. Jason reached out and placed a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder. "Dad, you made it," he said, his voice dripping with an artificial sweetness loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "We were worrying the drive might be too exhausting for you this evening. You look a little pale." Monica stepped forward, her eyes wide with fake sympathy. She reached out and touched my arm, her emerald gown brushing against my suit. "Oh, Richard," she cooed, her voice soft and soothing. "Are you sure you are feeling up to this? The lights and the noise can be so incredibly disorienting for you lately. Would you like a chair so you can sit quietly?" I looked down at the hand resting on my arm. The very same hand that had violently swiped my wife's life-saving medication off the wooden workbench. A primal urge surged through my chest, screaming at me to grab her wrist and break it right there. But I forced the monster back down. I let my shoulders slump forward. I blinked slowly, playing the role of the confused old man perfectly. "I am fine, Monica," I muttered, keeping my gaze fixed on the floor. "I just wanted to be here to support my son." Jason squeezed my shoulder, a triumphant smirk flashing across his face. "That is great, Dad," he said smoothly. "Just remember what we discussed. Tonight is a big night. When I call you up to the stage later, just smile and let me handle all the talking. You do not need to worry about a single thing anymore." I nodded slowly, letting him believe he broke my spirit. Jason guided me toward a table situated directly in the front row at the base of the main stage. I sat down, resting my hands on the crisp linen tablecloth. I looked up at the massive screen dominating the wall behind the podium. It was displaying the golden logo of M Holdings. Then I shifted my gaze toward the back corner of the grand ballroom. Situated behind a raised platform was the audio-visual control booth. A technician wearing heavy headphones was standing behind a mixing console. It was Bradley's man. Our eyes locked across the room. He gave me a perceptible nod, confirming he had successfully bypassed the hotel security protocols and hijacked the main feed. The trap was primed. At exactly 8, the quartet stopped playing. The murmur of conversations died down as the lights dimmed. A spotlight snapped on, illuminating the podium. Jason flashed a smile at Monica and began walking up the steps. The execution was finally about to begin. Jason approached the clear acrylic podium positioned at the center of the stage, adjusting the microphone with practiced ease. The bright spotlight caught the sharp lines of his face, making him look every bit the successful corporate executive he desperately pretended to be. He looked out over the sea of wealthy investors, bankers, and industry elites, flashing a brilliant, calculated smile. He tapped the microphone twice, the soft thumping sound echoing through the massive speakers and instantly quieting the murmuring crowd. "Welcome, everyone," Jason began, his voice smooth and dripping with artificial humility. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate the 10th anniversary of M Holdings. It is an absolute honor to stand before so many esteemed colleagues. But tonight is not just about looking forward to the future. It is also about honoring the past." He paused, letting his gaze sweep affectionately across the front row until it landed directly on me. As many of you know, my father, Richard, is the original foundation of this family empire. He built this company from the ground up. But time catches up with us, and recently my father has been dealing with some health challenges. We have decided as a family that it is time for him to step back and let me carry the heavy burden of leadership. A collective, sympathetic murmur rippled through the elegant ballroom. Wealthy men and women in expensive evening wear turned their heads to look at me, their faces painted with expressions of pity. Jason extended his hand toward me, his smile widening into a smug display of absolute victory. Please let us give a warm round of applause to my father and welcome him to the stage. The crowd immediately erupted into polite, respectful applause. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. I kept my shoulders slumped, my steps intentionally measured and unsteady. I played the declining patriarch to perfection. I walked up the short flight of carpeted stairs leading to the stage, gripping the wooden handrail for physical support. When I finally reached the podium, Jason wrapped his arm around my shoulders in a firm, patronizing embrace. "You are doing great, Dad," he whispered directly into my ear, his tone mocking and victorious. "Just keep it short." He handed me the sleek black microphone and stepped back, taking his place right beside Monica, who was beaming at the audience with her hands clasped delicately in front of her emerald gown. I gripped the microphone, feeling the cold, smooth metal against my calloused palm. I looked out at the hundreds of expectant faces staring back at me. The room was perfectly silent, waiting for the confused ramblings of a broken old man. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the freezing anger within me settle into a calm, terrifying focus. "Thank you, Jason," I said, my voice projecting clearly through the massive ballroom speakers. "And thank you all for being here tonight. When you spend 40 years of your life building something from the dirt, you spend a lot of time thinking about the concept of legacy. You think about what you are going to leave behind when you are gone. You pour your blood and sweat into laying a solid foundation, hoping the people who inherit your life's work will respect the immense sacrifices made to create it." I looked directly at the tables occupied by the commercial banking executives. A legacy is a heavy thing to carry. It requires honesty, because when you build a house on a foundation of lies, it does not matter how beautiful the expensive decorations are. Eventually, the structural framing will buckle, the walls will collapse, and the entire roof will come crashing down on everyone inside. The audience hung on my every word, completely captivated by the profound emotional weight of my delivery. A few older executives nodded in solemn agreement, entirely unaware of the literal warning I was issuing to them. I turned my head slightly and looked at Jason. He was standing just a few feet away, practically glowing with absolute smugness. He thought my speech was a touching, poetic surrender. He thought I was publicly accepting my own defeat and validating his hostile takeover. Beside him, Monica smiled, looking like a victorious queen, admiring her newly conquered kingdom. They were completely blinded by their own towering arrogance. They thought they had outsmarted me and permanently silenced the only threat to their stolen fortune. I turned my gaze back to the massive crowd. But a legacy is not just about the money or the corporate assets a father leaves to his son. I continued, my voice dropping an octave, losing the fragile tremor and taking on a sharp, commanding edge. It is also about the lessons we teach. It is about the absolute truth. And sometimes the most important piece of a family legacy is not what the father leaves behind. It is what the mother leaves behind to protect the truth. A sudden, subtle shift rippled through the atmosphere of the ballroom. Jason frowned slightly, his perfect artificial smile faltering for a fraction of a second. The mention of his mother is not in the script he had imagined for me. He shifted his weight uncomfortably, glancing nervously at Monica. I did not look at them anymore. I raised my chin and looked straight over the heads of the wealthy crowd to the back corner of the grand room. Through the dim lighting, I locked eyes with the audio-visual technician standing inside the raised control booth. He was staring right back at me, his hand resting firmly on the primary mixing console. I gave him a single deliberate nod. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, but it was the exact signal we had planned. I lowered the microphone, letting my arm drop completely to my side. The sentimental speech was now completely over. It was finally time for my wife to tell her side of the story. The moment my arm dropped to my side, the massive 20-foot LED screen behind the podium flickered. The towering golden logo of the fraudulent shell company vanished instantly. For a split second, the ballroom was plunged into an eerie, expectant darkness. Then a grainy, high-definition image snapped onto the display. The sudden shift in lighting painted the faces of the front-row guests in harsh, pale gray hues. The hidden camera footage of my wife's jewelry workshop loomed over the entire crowd. Simultaneously, the live string quartet was completely cut off in the middle of a beautiful note. The audio feed from the hidden camera was patched directly into the primary surround sound system of the grand ballroom. The low mechanical hum of the workshop space heater filled the cavernous room, followed immediately by the agonizing sound of my frail wife coughing. The hundreds of wealthy investors and banking executives initially looked confused. They murmured amongst themselves, perhaps assuming this was some strange, poorly edited tribute video to the late matriarch of the family empire. I stood perfectly still at the podium, my eyes locked on the crowd. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. I saw Jason turn his head to look at the screen. The glass of amber scotch slipped from his perfectly manicured hand, crashing against the hardwood floor of the stage. The sharp sound of shattering crystal echoed through the microphone, but it was entirely drowned out by the audio now booming from the speakers. On the massive screen, the heavy wooden door of the workshop swung open. The giant projected figures of Jason and Monica marched into the frame. The crowd watched as the argument erupted. Because the audio was professionally amplified by the technician, every word was terrifyingly clear. The investors heard Jason aggressively threaten his own mother. They heard him explicitly mention the forged bank documents. The collective breath of the entire ballroom seemed to vanish in an instant. Then the slap echoed through the room. The sound of Evelyn striking Jason across the face cracked like a literal gunshot through the high-end speakers. Several women in the audience gasped out loud. Men in tailored suits stiffened in their chairs. The horrifying reality of what they were watching was finally sinking in. This was not a tribute. This was a digital execution of the highest possible order. I turned my head to look directly at Jason. The smug, arrogant titan of industry was completely gone. His face was drained of all blood, turning a sickly, translucent white. His jaw hung open in absolute terror as he stared at his own towering image on the screen. Beside him, Monica looked like she had been struck by lightning. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, realizing that every single person in the ballroom was staring at her with growing disgust. On the 20-foot screen, the climax of the confrontation unfolded. My wife clutched her chest and collapsed immediately. The amplified sound of her desperate, shallow gasping for air filled the silent ballroom. It was a terrifying, deeply intimate sound of a human being dying. A prominent bank executive in the second row dropped his champagne flute. It shattered against the table, but nobody even flinched. They were completely paralyzed by the horror playing out above them. The audience watched Jason panic on screen. They saw him reach for the life-saving medication. And then they watched Monica lunge forward. On a 20-foot-tall display, there was absolutely no hiding the malicious intent in her violent, calculated movements. Every investor, every loan officer, every local politician in attendance watched Monica deliberately grab her husband's wrist. They watched her violently sweep her hand across the wooden workbench. The small orange pill bottle flew through the air, disappearing into the shadows. A wave of profound revulsion swept through the ballroom. People began to physically back away from the stage. Someone in the back shouted in absolute horror. On the screen, Monica pulled a weeping Jason out of the room. She turned off the lights. The screen went completely pitch black, leaving only the agonizing, amplified sounds of my dying wife. "Turn it off!" Monica shrieked, her voice cracking in wild, unrestrained panic. She lunged toward the edge of the stage, pointing a shaking finger at the audiovisual control booth in the back of the room. "Cut the feed right now! Turn the screen off!" But the technician did not touch a single button. The dark audio continued to play, burying them both in the undeniable evidence of their sheer evil. Jason could not handle the weight of the collective hatred radiating from the crowd. The immense pressure of his stolen life disintegrating in front of his eyes shattered him. He let out a strange, choking sob, his knees buckling beneath him. He collapsed right there on the stage, gripping the edge of the clear acrylic podium as his body convulsed. Right in front of the hundreds of people he had tried to impress, right in front of the bankers he needed to secure his future. Jason vomited violently onto the polished floorboards. He fell onto his hands and knees in his ruined bespoke tuxedo, sobbing uncontrollably into the mess he had made. Monica was completely hysterical. She grabbed the microphone stand, trying to yank the thick black cables forcefully. She screamed that it was a fake video, a total fabrication, a deep fake designed to ruin them both completely. But nobody was listening to her frantic lies. The banking executives who had funded her extravagant lifestyle were already pulling out their cell phones, dialing their legal departments, and demanding an immediate freeze on all corporate accounts. The facade was completely obliterated. I stood right beside the podium, looking down at the pathetic, weeping shell of my only son. I did not feel any pity. The ultimate humiliating payoff was delivered exactly as promised. I finally had absolute terrifying justice. The heavy doors at the back of the ballroom burst open. The shrill wail of police sirens had been growing louder outside the hotel, but the crowd had been too paralyzed by the video to notice. Now the flashing red and blue lights reflected off the chandeliers in the lobby. A dozen police officers, accompanied by federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with FBI printed across the back, marched into the room. They moved with absolute efficiency. Marcus had timed their arrival perfectly. The crowd of wealthy investors immediately parted, stepping back to clear a path toward the stage. The lead federal agent walked up the stairs, his eyes locked on the broken figures standing by the podium. Monica tried to run. She picked up the skirt of her emerald gown and scrambled toward the side exit, but two female officers intercepted her immediately. They grabbed her arms, forcing her against the wall. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs echoing across the silent room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. She thrashed and screamed, her hair unraveling, crying out that she was framed, that it was a terrible misunderstanding. But the agents did not even blink. They began reading her Miranda rights in a flat, clinical tone. On the stage, Jason did not try to run. He was still on his knees, surrounded by shattered glass and his own sickness. Two police officers hoisted him up by his armpits, dragging him away from the podium. As they forcefully pulled his hands behind his back and secured the handcuffs around his wrists, his terrified eyes locked onto mine. He looked like a frightened little boy. He was trembling, tears streaming down his pale face. "Dad," he sobbed, his voice cracking with desperate, pathetic panic. "Please, Dad, you have to help me. I am your son. You cannot let them take me away. Tell them it is a mistake." I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I looked at the boy I had sacrificed my entire life to protect, the boy who had gladly stepped over his own dying mother, just to steal my money. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I leaned in close so only he could hear my voice over the chaos of the ballroom. "Your mother packed your sentence," I whispered coldly. "I am just the delivery man." I watched without a shred of emotion as the police dragged my weeping son and his screaming wife out of the ballroom, parading them through the lobby in front of every person they had tried to impress. The hotel management began ushering the disturbed guests out of the venue. The grand gala, funded by fraud and built on a foundation of absolute evil, was officially over. Fast forward 3 weeks. The cool autumn air blew through the open window of Evelyn's old jewelry workshop. I stood in the center of the room, breathing in the familiar scent of cut pine and old silver polish. The heavy white plaster dust was completely swept away. The broken drywall where my wife had hidden the lockbox was repaired and freshly painted. The room was peaceful again. The aftermath of the ballroom execution was swift and brutal. Because we had frozen Monica's shell company, before she even knew what was happening, the authorities were able to seize the entire $4.5 million. The fraudulent home equity line of credit was nullified by the banking executives the very next morning to avoid a massive public relations scandal. My construction company was entirely returned to my control, the operating accounts restored, and Jason was permanently stripped of every corporate right he possessed. As for my son and my daughter-in-law, there was no expensive bail and there was no quiet settlement. The undeniable video evidence of them intentionally denying my wife her life-saving medication, combined with the financial fraud and forged signatures, secured a swift indictment. They are sitting in separate concrete cells in the county jail, awaiting a federal trial for corporate fraud, elder abuse, and involuntary manslaughter. They are facing decades behind bars, and they will spend every single day of that time knowing that they threw their entire lives away for absolutely nothing. I walked over to the wooden workbench where Evelyn had spent so many happy hours. I struck a match and lit a small white candle, placing it right on the corner of the table. I watched the golden flame flicker in the quiet room, casting a warm light over her old tools. I spent my entire life believing that family was simply a matter of blood. I believed that because Jason was my son, I owed him my unconditional trust and endless sacrifice. But pain is a profound teacher. I learned the hardest possible way that blood does not make a family. Respect, honesty, and love make a family. You can share the exact same genetics with someone, and they can still be the most dangerous predator in your life. Never allow anyone to use the word family as a weapon to force you into enduring their abuse, manipulation, or greed. If someone brings nothing but darkness and deceit into your home, you have every right to lock the door and walk away, no matter who they are. I am Richard. I lost the love of my life to the greed of my own son. But I survived, and I reclaimed my dignity, my home, and my absolute freedom. Thank you for listening today. If this story resonated with you, or if you have ever had to make the terrifying decision to cut toxic family members out of your life, please share your experience in the comments below. Let us build a community of support for those who are struggling. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another life story. Until next time, stay strong, protect peace, and always demand the respect you deserve.